Good morning. Great to see everyone. Man, it is cold out. It's a good day to, just kind of stay home in the evening, watch a little TV. I don't know, is anything good on tonight? Uh, that, that does that does remind me that I just I don't want to be a distraction or anything, but I thought I'd put that up there. No, that's nothing else to really say about that. But anyway, so 2026 is just zooming along, isn't it? I mean, we are in February already. Good thing is, in February, not tomorrow. I mean, tomorrow may be a holiday for spending on what happens tonight. But in 8 days we have as a holiday, and some of us, not all of us. It's not one of those that everybody gets off, but some folks get the next week from Monday off as a holiday. And I always like to have kind of some participation in ours. So I thought I would just ask. So what is it? What's the federal holiday that's February 16th, a week from tomorrow? President's Day. So President's Day. So that's a day, right? We celebrate by getting a new appliance or a good deal on a car loan. Actually, it's not President's Day. And you might be saying, what? A week from tomorrow, I said, what's the federal holiday that we celebrate a week from tomorrow? I don't know if we have any federal employees that might be able to know what I'm saying. What is the holiday a week from tomorrow? Washington's birthday is the name of the holiday. It's those appliance makers and car dealers who like to use the term President's Day. The holidays, actually, it's a federal holiday, Washington's birthday, which means states are free to give it their own name. And say, oh, that's why we get the name President's Day instead of Washington's birthday is get used. But it's actually not that simple. I thought this was kind of interesting. So the federal holiday is Washington's birthday, right? Only 7 states use the federal name. Massachusetts is one of them. The Massachusetts state holiday a week from tomorrow is Washington's birthday, not President's Day. But it gets more complicated than that because in 12 states, it's President's Day, right? But in another 12 states, it's President apostrophe S Day, not S apostrophe. And then in 3 states, it's President's Day without an apostrophe. All right? And you might be wondering, which one is correct? And if you go to a style guide, they're all 3 equally correct. Or equally wrong, I guess that means. So in 5 states, the official name is some combination of Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday, and then it gets even more complicated. 9 states don't observe the holiday, so you don't get it off as a state holiday if you are in one of those 9 states. Alabama, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson's birthday is the name of the holiday. And last but not least, in Arkansas, it's George Washington and Daisy Gatson Bates Day. Daisy Gatson Bates is a civil rights leader from Arkansas. And so this is a much more complicated holiday than I ever thought, which was kind of interesting. But what I thought I would do, right, we are 8 days away from observing Washington's birthday or President's Day. I'll call it President's Day to make it simple. We are, let's see, make sure, 14 days from George Washington's actual birthday. His actual birthday is February 22nd. But we're only 4 days away from Abraham Lincoln's actual birthday. And so what I thought I would actually do is try and tie in today's message with some words from Abraham Lincoln that he spoke over 150 years ago. I thought that would be fitting for us to do and see what we can learn from that. So, what I want to do, though, is set some context for that before I dive right into that. So, here's what I want you to think about. It's March 4th, 1865. Okay? A couple of months previous to that, Abraham Lincoln had been elected to his second term as president in a landslide victory. And here on March 4th, he's getting ready to give his inaugural address to begin his second term as president of the United States. In fact, here's an actual picture of that speech. And it's really hard to see, but I circled the picture of Abraham Lincoln getting ready to give his inaugural speech. This is kind of a famous picture, and if you're a history buff, some of you may know that person happens to be John Wilkes Booth, who's actually attended the inauguration. But that's not what this talk is about. I just thought that was kind of interesting. Anyway, all right, but let me further set the stage. If you recall, in March of 1865, the United States is in the midst of the Civil War. And I think that we sometimes forget just how horrible the Civil War was for the United States. There were more than 600,000 people killed in the Civil War. And if you compare the population of the United States then to the population of the United States now, that would be like more than 6 million people dying, relatively speaking. There were as many people killed in the Civil War as in all other U.S. wars combined. It was horrible and bloody for us as a country. But by 1865, the war was coming to an end. And it was pretty clear that the Union in the North was going to win and the Confederate States in the South were going to lose. So there were a lot of people in Lincoln's party, his supporters, that wanted him to use his inaugural address as a victory speech, to tout how well the North had done and to put the South on notice that there was going to be revenge to be paid for the bloody cost of the Civil War. So what did he say? I always think about, what would politicians today say if they were going to have that platform? Or what would we as individuals say if we were going to have that platform? So we're going to take a look at what Abraham Lincoln said. But before we do that, here's a nice zoom in of Lincoln. But before we do that, I want to take a look at what Jesus and the Bible has to say about situations like this. Situations where we might be addressing people that we don't agree with, that might not believe what we believe, that might not look like us or talk like us or act like us. We're clearly not going to be in a situation like Abraham Lincoln, but I suspect on an almost daily basis, you may encounter people like that, whether they be your family, your friends, your coworkers, who may not believe like you, talk like you, look like you, act like you, may have even hurt you, but you need to deal with them. So we'll look at what the Bible has to say with that, and then we'll circle back and see, how did Abraham Lincoln do? And what I want to do is I want to look at these things in three ways. First, I want to look at, what does society expect us to do when we encounter people who are different from us? What are the pressures of social media telling us of how we should act and how we should respond? And then how does Jesus expect us to respond? And finally, we'll look at, how do we respond like Jesus, assuming those first two things aren't the same. So let's start. How does society expect us to respond? Back in 1950, the American Political Science Association issued a report. So we're talking about 75 years ago. And the report they issued was on polarization in politics. And they were concerned. 75 years ago, and they were concerned about the amount of polarization in politics in the United States. Although, let me clarify one thing. They were concerned that there was not enough polarization in politics in the United States. And it was a problem because they felt it meant that voters didn't have a choice, because no matter which political party you went to, they basically agreed on everything, which also meant that issues weren't really getting debated because, again, the political parties they just kind of agreed on it all. And they thought this was a real problem. So that was the issue in 1950. I have some good news for you. It's not a problem anymore. We don't suffer from not having enough polarization. Whew. Of course, the problem is we have swung way over. I'm not keeping up with my slides, right? There's not enough polarization. We now have plenty of polarization. There was an article that came out about 5 years ago, and I actually shared some about it. It's kind of about 5 years ago when we were going into the pandemic, that characterized how we tend now to interact with people that we don't agree with. And I thought it was really relevant then, and I think it's even more relevant now, so I wanted to slightly revisit it. And what it talks about is 3 terms that describe how we tend to interact with people who we may not agree with, or who may not look like us, or speak like us, or believe like us, or who may have hurt us. There's 3 terms. And so let me go through them. The first term, othering. You may have heard of that term. Othering. Othering means that if someone doesn't agree with us, they're suddenly not part of our group. We're us, and they're them. They're suddenly them if they don't agree with with us, or they're different from us. They're now not part of us. They're them. That's othering. That tends to be one word that kind of characterizes, in today's environment, how we tend to think about people we don't agree with. So that's one. A second one is aversion. Aversion is the idea that if someone doesn't agree with us, then we don't view them just as different. We actually think of them as dislikable. In other words, today, more than ever, if someone doesn't agree with us, we tend to go straight to not liking them, just because they don't agree with us. It's a very common thing. And then the third characteristic is called moralization. Moralization, that is the idea where we begin to view people who believe differently than us as actually being morally bankrupt. Meaning that today, more than ever, if someone doesn't agree with us, we actually start to think of them as bad people. We begin to feel like either you are for me and in the in-group, or you are against me and you are part of them. That tends to be more and more the way we tend to interact with people, if we're not careful, that are different than us. So, what do you think about those 3 characteristics? Othering, aversion, moralization. Have you ever experienced them? I will have to admit that I have. I would like to think I'm above this and wouldn't be impacted by it. But it's such a pervasive atmosphere in this world. It's hard not to. So I remember a story with my wife, Karen, and I. We were out traveling, and we were in a different part of the country. And one of the things that we love to do is, whenever we're traveling, is go to, we like to find like a hole-in-the-wall diner, a local place. That's just part of what we like to do. And so we had done that. We went to we found a breakfast place that we wanted to go to. We were having breakfast. We were having a great time. We were interacting with the server. really enjoying our morning. And this was kind of as we were coming out of the pandemic, was kind of the time. And I forget how the conversation really went, but as part of that conversation, it became really clear that when, like, the topic of immunization somehow had kind of come up. And then it got into a little bit of kind of politics, and it became very clear that this person was very different from us. And who believed what and what, it's not important. It just became very clear that they were believed very differently than we did. And this person, none of the conversation was in any kind of way of this is what you should believe or this is how you should feel. It was none of that. It's just that it became apparent this person was very different from us. And all of a sudden, in hindsight, we realized the tone of our conversation changed. And it wasn't quite as free as it had been. And we suddenly had this feeling of, you know what, we just need to kind of wrap up our meal and just kind of move on, which is what we did. And then afterwards, we were kind of going along and we wanted to start to kind of process it. And we're like, what just happened? How did that happen? Like all that happened was we just kind of recognized this big difference between us and it changed things. Why was that? And we realized we had fallen victim to that. It's really easy to have happen. And maybe you've experienced it yourself. But is that how Jesus would want us to react? Well, let's take a look. Let's see how Jesus would expect us to respond in those kinds of situations. And I want to start with the basics. The basics. So when an expert in the law, in the Bible, confronted Jesus, this expert asked, what was the greatest commandment? And you all probably, many of you have kind of heard this and know the answer to that, right? The answer that Jesus gave was that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And then for no extra charge, without being asked, he threw in number 2. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Which then, that raises the question, well then who's my neighbor? Who's my neighbor? And as Jesus would often do, he didn't give a straight answer. He didn't give a direct answer to that question. He told a story. A story, again, that many of you all are familiar with. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan, is what it's referred to often as, that he shared about. That's the parable where you have a man who lies beaten on the side of the road, and a Levite and a priest come by, and they pass that suffering person without stopping. And then a person from Samaria, which is a people group that then was traditionally very despised by the Jews, stopped and went above and beyond to help. And so Jesus concludes that story by asking the people listening to him who had been a neighbor to that man. And an application of that parable is often that we should notice those in need around us and respond regardless of who they are or what group they might identify with. And that is certainly true, that is what we should do. But I would say that the application should go even deeper, meaning that people are not our neighbors just when they are in need. We need to be loving and accepting of all people all the time. We love our neighbors as ourselves by loving everyone as ourselves, whether they are in need or not. Which is also why I think Paul, later in the Bible, says that when it comes to Jesus, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Jesus Christ. And you may say, yes, but what if those people don't believe the way I believe? Or what if they don't agree with my views, or they've done things that I don't agree with? Well, that's where Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount becomes so uncomfortable. Because he doesn't say, be nice to people who are nice to you. That's not love. That's a transaction. What he says is, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Why? Because that's what your Father in heaven does. The very next verse after that one, oh, not that one, is where Jesus says that God calls the rain to fall on the righteous and the unrighteous, or the sun to rise on the good and the evil. God's love is radically indiscriminate. And Paul calls us not to lash out even when it might feel like it's the natural thing to do. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. I love that last line, right? As far as it depends on you. So that doesn't mean that we don't speak the truth or we blindly allow ourselves to be taken advantage of. It doesn't mean there aren't times where we need to oppose. But it says a lot about what our attitude should be in our response. We shouldn't be responding to hateful speech with our own hateful speech. It's a lot for us to think about. So if that's what Jesus calls us to do, how can we try to be more like Jesus when we are responding to situations like that, where we're encountering people who we don't agree with, or who may not look like us or talk like us or believe like us? I think that what we have to understand, I think we all do, is that teaching is impossible to do if we try to do it on our own. We can't manufacture love for our enemies. We can't manufacture love for our enemies just by sheer willpower. We can't simply decide not to have ill will towards those we disagree with or who we feel might have wronged us, because it goes against every instinct that we have of self-protection and justice. The answer really lies in the gospel, the good news. Remember that the gospel is not good advice, right? It's good news. Advice tells you what you have to do. News tells you what's already happened. And it's only when we lean into what God has done for us that we can extend the same grace to others. And here's the logic. Every one of us, if we're honest, has been a rebel against God. We've gone our own way. We've elevated ourselves above him. And what is God's response? Revenge? Malice? No. Judgment? Yes. But he took the judgment on himself. On the cross, Jesus Christ absorbed the malice, the punishment, the wrath that our rebellion towards God deserved. And in his place, he gave us charity and love, undeserved, lavish, and complete. The gospel says, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son. We deserved some condemnation. He gave us adoption. We earned death. He gave us life. And once we see this, once we really see it, everything changes. We can't hold on to that malice and hate when we realize how much malice and hate-deserving rebellion God has forgiven in us. Charity and love towards all flows from the recognition that every human being, including the ones you don't agree with, is both a sinner and an image bearer of God. So let's get practical. How do we practice this on an everyday basis? What we need to do is practice seeing people through God's eyes, not through our own eyes. And let me share with you a study that was published in the UK about 20 years ago that I think really illustrates this. And what happened in this part of this study is the people doing the study had a questionnaire. And in the questionnaire, they were identifying people who were fans of Manchester United. I don't know if you all are familiar with Manchester United, one of the most famous leagues, soccer teams in the English Premier League. And so they wanted in this questionnaire to identify fans of Manchester United, and the questionnaire really reinforced their identity and allegiance to Manchester United. So they found these folks that fit that bill and they knew were really strongly identified with Manchester United. And then each participant was told that the next thing they needed to do was go across the street to another building, and there would be a short video for them to watch, would be the next thing. And so as they were going across the street, what would happen is a person would jog by. This person had been hired by the researchers, and this person would, as they were running by, they would fall and grab their ankle and act as if they'd been hurt, had sprained their ankle. And the researchers wanted to see what the person who was in the study would do. The thing you need to know is sometimes the person who was jogging was wearing a Manchester United shirt. And sometimes the person jogging was wearing a Liverpool shirt. Now, you might not know if you're not English. Liverpool and Manchester United are like the Yankees and Red Sox of the English Premier League, huge rivals. So they wanted to see, would that make a difference in how people responded? And so what happened? Probably not surprised to hear what happened. If the person jogging was wearing a Manchester United shirt, 92% of the time, the people in the study would stop to help them. If the person was wearing a Liverpool shirt, 30% of the time, they'd stop to help them. And so the study showed how we're far more likely to be empathetic towards and want to help those who we identify with the same things, right? And we're much less likely to do that if we don't identify with the same things. But then they tried something a little different. They took the study a step further, and they found they did another questionnaire, again to find Manchester United fans. But this time, the questionnaire didn't emphasize allegiance to Manchester United. What it emphasized was soccer. How great it was to be involved with soccer and how wonderful soccer was. And then they repeated the same thing. Go across the street, have a jogger come by, sometimes wear a Manchester United shirt, sometimes wear a Liverpool shirt. And what happened? 70% of the time, they would stop to help the person. And it didn't matter if they were wearing a Manchester shirt or a Liverpool shirt. Because what was in their mind was not identifying as a Manchester fan. What went through their mind was identifying as a soccer fan. And so it didn't matter if they had a Liverpool shirt on, they were a soccer fan. And it's great to be a soccer fan. You're in the in crowd if you're a soccer fan, and they would stop 70% of the time. And you may be like, well, I can't really relate to that. Okay, well, maybe you can replace if you were to replace the teams and do it, maybe that helps it kind of go on. So the thing to think about is, how do you view those who are around you? Do you see them as primarily members of a political party or advocates for or against a political cause or concern? Do you see them as members of particular ethnicity or a socioeconomic class? Or do you see the people around you as people who are created in the image of God, loved passionately by God, and deserving of love and charity in the same way that God gave it to us? In a culture that is increasingly defined by outrage and tribalism, by the assumption of the worst motives in each other, we have a rare opportunity not to be neutral, not to be passive, but to be different. It means in our politically divided moment, we refuse to demonize those who disagree with us. We refuse to assume the worst motives. We refuse to reduce complex human beings to their worst moment or their worst opinion. Instead, we should strive to listen, to share, to understand, and be open to learn about others and ourselves. It means that in our families and our workplaces and our churches, we become known not for our ability to hold a grudge, but for our scandalous capacity to listen and forgive. Can we do this? Yes. Is it difficult? Yes, it is. But it can make all the difference, both for the people we interact with and for ourselves. Now, in closing, I need to revisit what Abraham Lincoln said. Lincoln's second inaugural address was 703 words long, and it's the second shortest inaugural address ever given. 505 of those words were just one syllable. It was a quick message. But in that message, he mentioned God 14 times. He quoted scripture 4 times, and he invoked prayer 4 times. The abolitionist Frederick Douglass was in the crowd, and he wrote in his journal that the address sounded more like a sermon than a state address. There's a lot that could be said about it, and that's why that it's actually been memorialized. If you go to the Lincoln Memorial, on the walls behind it, on one side is the Gettysburg Address, and on the other side is his second inaugural address. In this speech, you won't hear any hint of boasting. You won't hear any celebration of the North's impending victory. No delight in the Confederacy's defeat. And while Lincoln clearly identified slavery as the just cause of the war, he didn't hang it around the South alone. Instead, he referred to it as American slavery. And despite the terrible, bloody cost of the Civil War, he knew that the only path forward for the country, the only hope to break the cycle of violence and to reunite the country, were these words that have become very famous. His final words of encouragement were, "With malice toward none," whether you're from the North or the South, "with malice towards none, with charity for all, with love towards all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right." So a humility of not saying only our way. "Let us strive to finish the work we are in together." So, in closing, may we just pray that we are able in our country to have a similar posture of humility and love today. Thank you.